When my grandson said, "Grandma, we need your help. We're getting married," I was already lying in a hospital bed, barely breathing. His fiancée didn't even send a card, but someone else was there. The one who washed my feet and whispered that I was family. Back then, I stayed silent. But now, I speak, through a notary, at the wedding, out loud. And everyone froze, because the name in the letter wasn't the one they expected. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Evelyn Morris. I was 79 years old when my body finally reminded me that I wasn't immortal. For most of my life, I had worked as a school nurse in a small town in northern Arkansas. I wasn't one for drama or noise. I kept to my duties, handed out Band-Aids and calm words, and after retirement, I filled my days with tending to violets, sewing linens for the church, and collecting old books on medicinal herbs. My home smelled like lavender and lemon balm. The windows let in soft light, and the porch creaked in a way that felt familiar, like an old song. I lived alone after my husband passed. We had one son, and he had a son of his own, my grandson, Liam. Liam had grown up in my backyard, under my watch, chasing fireflies and biting into slices of watermelon I'd kept cold in the fridge. But children grow, and so does the distance between holidays. Liam moved to the city for college, then stayed. We spoke less. He had girlfriends, then one he brought home once, but that was a long time ago. Time blurred those details. One morning, I woke up and couldn't stand. Not because of a fall, not because of something I remembered doing. I simply couldn't. My arms trembled when I tried to push myself up. My vision spun. My breath felt shallow. The stillness was not peaceful. It was terrifying. I managed to knock my phone off the nightstand and call 911. The paramedics broke down my front door. I remember the sound of it splintering. I remember how they whispered, thinking I couldn't hear. She must have been down a while. They moved fast, but their faces already looked apologetic, like they weren't sure if I'd make it through the night. One of them patted my hand as they wheeled me in, and that touch said what none of them wanted to speak aloud. At the hospital, the light was always on. I hated it. The ceiling tiles all looked the same, whether it was morning or evening. I had tubes in my arms, beeping machines near my head. Nurses spoke in gentle voices, efficient but distant. I wasn't anyone special there, just another old woman who'd gone down. I heard that phrase more than once. Gone down, like a tree in a storm, without warning. The first day, no one came. The second, still silence. I wasn't angry, just tired. On the third day, I was moved to a quieter room, which I took as a sign. I didn't ask for anything, not even to call someone. I didn't want my son's voice wrapped in guilt or my grandson's excuses. I didn't want flowers that would wilt by the weekend. But then, someone came. Not family. Not who anyone would have expected. It was Julia. She walked in holding a paper bag and a small glass jar. I didn't recognize her at first. She looked older, softer, sadder, but her voice was the same. Warm, low, steady. "I brought you tea," she said. Not a question, not an offering, just a fact. She sat beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I realized, for the first time in days, I didn't feel invisible. Julia had been Liam's girlfriend years ago, the one who stayed behind to help me clean up after barbecues, the one who called me Miss Evelyn, even after I told her she didn't have to, the one he left, suddenly and without much explanation. I remembered thinking it was a shame. She had eyes that saw more than people said. She visited every day that week, not long stays, just enough to refill my water, brush my hair, read aloud from a book I hadn't finished. She didn't ask me about the others, and I didn't ask her why she came. We didn't need to. Sometimes presence speaks louder than questions. One morning, I opened my eyes to see her folding my sweater. The blue one my late husband used to say brought out my eyes. I must have mumbled something because she smiled and said, "You looked cold yesterday." No fanfare, no pity. I found myself waiting for her visits. I didn't feel like a patient when she was there. I felt like a person, like someone remembered. A week into her visits, a nurse leaned in and asked if Julia was my daughter. I said no, then paused. "She's my granddaughter," I corrected. The nurse nodded, satisfied. I let it stand. When I was finally discharged, Julia was the one who picked me up, not my son, not my grandson. She had vacuumed my house, changed my bed sheets, stocked the pantry. There was chicken soup in the fridge and a bouquet of lilacs on the counter. I nearly cried when I saw them, not because of the gesture, but because she knew lilacs were my favorite. She helped me into bed that night, pulled the covers up with the same care a mother might use. Then she said goodnight, and I watched her go. The door clicked gently behind her, and I stared at the ceiling again. But it didn't feel as heavy this time. The room wasn't just mine. It had her warmth in it, tucked between the sheets and folded sweaters. I didn't know then what I would do, but I knew something had shifted. I had been seen, not as a burden, not as a calendar obligation, but as someone worth sitting beside. And in the quiet that followed, I decided, not everyone deserves your best, but those who give it freely, they deserve more than you planned to give. The day I opened the door and saw her standing there, I was wearing my oldest robe, the one with a coffee stain that wouldn't come out no matter how many times I scrubbed it. My hair was unbrushed, my back still aching from a restless night, and I hadn't even made it to the kitchen for tea. But there she was, Julia, holding a plastic container and a brown grocery bag. She smiled like it wasn't strange, like we had done this every week for years. And without thinking, I stepped aside and let her in. I didn't ask why she had come. I didn't want to risk hearing an answer that might make me cry. She moved through the house quietly, like someone returning to an old place they still remembered in detail. She put the food in the fridge, set out a napkin, and told me to sit. I sat, not because I was hungry, but because I felt too stunned to do anything else. She reheated some kind of soup, not the store-bought kind, not something poured from a can. It was thick, golden, with bits of barley and carrots and a smell that clung to the walls. She had even packed a slice of cornbread, wrapped in parchment like a gift. I watched her move, steady, unrushed, and all I could think was, why is she here? I hadn't seen her in years. The last time was at my grandson's birthday, maybe 4 years earlier. She was there in the corner, half invisible, while Liam opened expensive boxes and grinned for photos. She had left shortly after that, quietly, and he never mentioned her again. Later, I heard about a new girl, then another. Then the one he said was the one. Her name was Lauren. Or maybe Lauren. I couldn't remember. She hadn't visited me. Not once. But Julia was here. She didn't bring questions or apologies. She didn't bring explanations, only warm food and gentle hands. She changed the sheets on my bed without asking. She dusted the bookshelf, picked up the broken lamp I had left leaning in the hallway. She watered the plants. I hadn't even noticed they were drying out. That afternoon, after she left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. Just stood. I looked at the small gestures scattered around me. Folded dish towels, the careful arrangement of mail, the pot scrubbed clean in the sink, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not gratitude, not surprise, but recognition. She came back again the next day. This time, with crackers, soft cheese, and tea bags, she said were for sleep. I didn't remember mentioning my insomnia, but somehow she knew. She talked not much, but just enough to fill the silence. She told me about a part-time job at a bookstore, said she liked alphabetizing, that it gave her a strange sense of control. I understood that more than I let on. I began to wait for her visits. I didn't admit it to myself at first, but I watched the clock more closely in the afternoons. I checked the porch more often. I made the effort to put on a proper blouse, the kind with buttons. Sometimes I even brushed my hair. Not for vanity, for presence. Meanwhile, the rest of the family stayed distant. My son would call once a week, usually distracted, usually between tasks. My grandson sent texts, short ones. "You good?" or "Need anything?" Once he sent me a meme about old people using emojis. I didn't know if it was meant to be sweet or just careless. Then, one Saturday morning, I received an invitation in the mail. Thick envelope, cream-colored paper with embossed lettering. Liam and Lauren were getting married. There was a photo inside, a glossy image of them posed beneath an archway of white roses, his hand on her waist, her smile polished, perfect, a little too tight. I stared at that photo for a long time. I traced the outline of Liam's suit, his watch, the shine on his shoes. Then I looked at the back of the invitation. There was no mention of me beyond the generic, "We are pleased to invite you." Not Grandma, not Evelyn, just a name on a mailing list. The irony settled in slowly. I hadn't seen him in almost a year. I hadn't spoken to her, Lauren, ever. And now I was being summoned like a distant obligation. Not because I mattered, but because it would have looked odd if they didn't invite the old woman who once paid for Liam's tuition. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I just folded the invitation, tucked it into a drawer, and turned back to my tea. Later that week, Julia returned. She had picked up a library book I had requested and baked lemon cookies. She handed them to me like it was nothing. But when she left that night, I sat by the window, watching her walk to her car. Her coat flapped gently in the breeze, and I realized I didn't know where she lived. I didn't know how she got the time off work. I didn't know who else she cared for. And yet somehow, she had become the most reliable person in my life. In her absence, the house felt colder, not physically, spiritually. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stood by the bookshelf. There, tucked behind an old photo frame, was a checkbook I hadn't touched in months. I pulled it out, held it, thought about the number Liam might ask for, the number he probably expected. The guest no one expected had reminded me what loyalty looked like, what care without conditions felt like. And in that moment, I knew. Some people bring you flowers when you're well. Others bring you broth when you're broken. And only one of them should be called family. It was a Thursday morning when Liam finally called. I was in the middle of slicing pears for a pie, hands sticky with juice, the radio humming softly in the background. His name flashing on the screen made me pause. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. His voice was upbeat, almost too cheerful, like someone selling something he didn't believe in. He talked about the wedding, how everything was coming together, how excited Lauren was, how they had chosen the venue on the lake with white drapery and chandeliers that looked like glass raindrops. I listened. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I made small noises to let him know I was still there. Then came the pause, the drop in tone, the clearing of his throat. He said, "We were hoping you could help us, Grandma." That was the moment I knew what this call was really about. He mentioned costs, how expensive weddings were these days, how even basic things like table settings and florals could run into the thousands. He spoke like he had done his homework. He listed figures, the caterer's minimum, the photographer's package, the venue's non-refundable deposit. I heard the word essential more than once. He said it wasn't just for them. It was for the family, for memories, for tradition. He reminded me how much I loved family events. He said Lauren had always dreamed of a wedding like this, that it would mean so much to have my support. He never once asked how I was feeling. He didn't ask what I had been doing, if I'd seen anyone, if I'd needed anything during the past few months. He didn't ask about the doctor's visit I mentioned in passing 2 months ago. He just asked for help. Money. A transaction dressed up in sentiment. I didn't respond with a yes or a no. I said I'd think about it. He thanked me too quickly and hung up. That was it. No follow-up, no questions, just assumed generosity. I sat at the table after the call, staring at the pears. The slices had browned. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and something sour I couldn't name. I looked out the window at the backyard, the garden I hadn't tended in weeks. It looked dry, overgrown, forgotten, much like I had felt lately. I took out my checkbook later that day. The familiar weight of it in my hand brought back decades. College tuition for Liam, the down payment for my son's first house, the medical bills after my husband's second surgery. My hands had written numbers for everyone else's needs more times than I could count. Rarely had they written anything just for me. I stared at the blank line. I could have written Liam's name. I could have done what he expected. It wouldn't have hurt me financially, but it would have cost something else, something deeper. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Halstead. We had worked together since my husband died. He had a neat voice, calm, never rushed. I told him I wanted to draft a letter and a legal gift document. I told him who it was for, not Liam, not Lauren, Julia. He didn't ask questions. He just asked for the details. I gave him the amount I intended to gift, a sum large enough to make a difference. It wasn't showy, but it was intentional. I told him I wanted the letter to be read aloud at the wedding, by someone neutral, someone official. I told him I wanted no drama, only clarity. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition. The letter wasn't long. It said that I had chosen to give my financial gift not based on bloodline, but on compassion, that the recipient had shown loyalty without expectation, that she had offered care during a time of need, without asking for anything in return, that such character deserved to be acknowledged, not quietly, but publicly, that this was my decision, made freely, and that the matter was final. I signed the document with a steady hand. I included something else with the papers, a ring, not flashy, not ornate, a modest gold band with a small ruby. It had belonged to my mother, passed down to me when I got married. I had worn it every Sunday for years. I had always imagined giving it to someone who would understand the quiet strength it symbolized. And now I knew who that was. I placed the ring in a velvet pouch and sealed it with the letter. When Mr. Halstead asked if I wanted to inform the recipient beforehand, I said no. Let it come when it's meant to come. Let it arrive when the room is filled with the people who assumed they knew everything. Let it speak not with spite, but with certainty. After everything was signed, copied, and notarized, I walked out of his office into the sunlight. It was warm. The breeze was light, touching my skin like an old friend. I stood for a long while on the steps, breathing in the quiet satisfaction of having done something that felt right. Back at home, I placed my checkbook back in its drawer. I baked another pie that night, this time with fresh apples and nutmeg. I placed 2 slices on the table, one for me, one wrapped in foil. Julia arrived the next morning. She looked tired but smiled anyway. I handed her the foil-wrapped pie and told her to take it home. She thanked me. She didn't know what else I had given her. Not yet. I wasn't surprised when the formal invitation never arrived. I had expected it might not, even after Liam's request for help. But something about its absence still stung. There was a finality to being left out, a quiet dismissal that cut deeper than words. I checked the mail each day for a week, not because I hoped. It was more about confirming what I already knew. Instead of an envelope, I got a notification on my phone, a tagged photo. Liam and Lauren standing in front of a floral backdrop, holding glasses of champagne, her left hand raised toward the camera, showing off a diamond that looked far too large to be tasteful. The caption read, T-2 weeks. Let the countdown begin. There were hashtags and hearts, dozens of comments, but none from me. I didn't press like. I didn't respond. A few days later, another post appeared. This one showed Lauren in my living room. I recognized the rug beneath her feet, the antique lamp in the corner, the vase I'd kept near the window. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all in matching robes, sipping something bubbly and laughing. The caption said, "Grateful to borrow this cozy space for our bridal brunch. Nothing like tradition." I stared at the screen for a long time. That room, my room, had been used without my presence, without my blessing, as a backdrop for a life I was no longer included in. I closed the app and set the phone face down on the table. The image lingered anyway. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the entitlement, the way she stood in my space as though she had claimed it, like a territory conquered not through kindness, but through assumption. I didn't call Liam. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't want one. What would be the point? I had already made my decision. My name wouldn't appear in the seating chart, but my voice, my choice, would. The next morning, I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. It had been years since I'd looked inside. The scent of cedar was still strong, sharp, and earthy. Inside were memories, pressed linens, a faded quilt, letters I hadn't reread since my husband passed. I reached beneath them and pulled out the fabric I'd been saving for something quiet and special. A bolt of soft gray wool silk, smooth to the touch, with a muted elegance that didn't need sequins or shine. I spent the next several days sewing. The motion was familiar, meditative. Needle through fabric, stitch by stitch. My fingers ached more than they used to. I pricked myself a few times, but the rhythm grounded me. I didn't make a dress for a wedding. I made it for presence, for clarity, for the part of myself that refused to disappear. While I worked, I played old records, Ella Fitzgerald, Nina Simone, women with voices that filled empty rooms. I opened the windows and let the spring air in. The house creaked and sighed around me, but I didn't feel alone. I felt composed. I ironed the hem carefully, folded the dress over a padded hanger, and hung it where I could see it each morning. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. In the days that followed, I made other preparations. I spoke again with Mr. Halstead to confirm everything was in place. He assured me that the letter would be delivered to the venue on time, that a representative would be present to read it before the ceremony. I trusted him. He had always been a man who understood discretion and, more importantly, intention. I bought a small pair of pearl earrings and polished my shoes. I took the time to steam the lining of my coat, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to arrive as myself, fully, unapologetically. I knew the guest list would be tight, curated, filtered for appearances. I wasn't on it. That suited me fine. Some things are more powerful when they arrive from outside the frame. Not everyone needs a seat to be seen. Julia visited once during that week. She brought a jar of strawberry preserves she had made herself. We sat in the sunroom sipping tea. She didn't know what I was planning. I didn't tell her. I watched her speak about her job, her plans to go back to school, her recent apartment hunt. Her face lit up when she talked about a small unit near the library, one with a corner window and an old radiator that hummed in the mornings. I smiled and nodded, asking all the right questions, but inside, I was folding memories and tucking them away, preparing to give her something she didn't see coming. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, hands clasped over my chest, eyes open to the dark. I thought about all the weddings I'd been to in my life. How many had been showy and shallow? How many had been simple and true? I thought about the people who were remembered in stories, never for their gifts or their dresses, but for their presence, their choices, the things they stood up for when it wasn't easy. By morning, I was ready, not to attend, not to smile for photos, but to be felt, to let my words, my truth, enter a room that thought it had silenced me, not with vengeance, not with cruelty, but with clarity and grace. The morning of the wedding arrived with a hush, the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful but heavy. I woke early before the sun had fully lifted over the horizon. The house felt still, untouched. I moved quietly through the rooms, as if not to disturb the air, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. I laid the gray dress across my bed and dressed slowly, carefully. The fabric was cool against my skin, and it fell around my body like a whisper. The pearl earrings sat in a velvet box on my dresser. I fastened them with steady hands. No makeup, no perfume. Just a pressed handkerchief tucked into my coat pocket and my late husband's watch on my wrist, worn like a memory. I didn't expect anyone to notice me. That was never the plan. I called for a car an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Not a taxi or a rideshare. A private driver arranged through Mr. Halstead. A black sedan, polished, discreet. When it pulled up to the curb, I stepped inside without a word. The driver greeted me, then let the silence return. We drove past neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years, past shops with new signs, past families on their morning walks. It all blurred into the glass. The venue was perched on the edge of a lake, a sprawling estate dressed in white tents and silk ribbons, trimmed hedges and imported flowers. The entrance was lined with lanterns, and a string quartet was rehearsing near the garden arch. It was a place built for photographs, not for moments. From the car, I could see the guests arriving. Women in pastel gowns, men in tailored suits, children polished like porcelain. Everyone looked perfect, smiling, poised, not a wrinkle out of place. I stayed in the car. I wasn't invited after all. But Mr. Halstead's assistant, a tall man in his early 30s with a calm expression, stepped onto the gravel path right on time. He carried a slim leather folder under one arm. When he entered the tent, I didn't need to follow him. I had already written everything I needed to say, and it was about to be said without me. Through the open windows, I could hear the hum of the crowd, chairs shifting, soft laughter, a flute pouring champagne, the officiant adjusting the microphone, and then a quieting, a change in energy, the subtle shift of bodies turning toward the sound system. The moment had arrived. The assistant stepped to the front, just as we'd agreed. He cleared his throat and began to read. He introduced himself and said he was there on behalf of the groom's grandmother, Evelyn Morris. He explained that, though she had not been invited to attend, she wished to offer a gift and a few words. Then came the letter. I couldn't hear the exact phrasing from the car. I knew every sentence by heart, but I watched the reactions instead. The heads tilting, the mouths parting, the turning of shoulders toward one another. I saw Liam's face stiffen, his smile falter. Lauren's hand tightened around her bouquet. Her gaze narrowed. She whispered something sharply to her maid of honor. The assistant continued. I knew the moment the recipient's name was read. Julia, not Lauren, not the bride of the day, but the woman who had stood beside me when there was no audience, no ribbon, no applause. The gift was hers, the money, the letter, the family ring, everything I had been expected to give, redirected. Gasps rippled through the tent. Someone clapped once, then stopped. A few guests exchanged glances. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. One of the younger cousins looked at Liam like he'd never seen him before. Even from a distance, I could read the embarrassment on his face, the disbelief, the shame. Lauren stepped forward, visibly rattled, as if to interrupt. But the assistant finished with composure and stepped back. There was no argument to make. Everything had been legal, final, delivered with elegance and weight. I sat in the car with my hands folded in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't gloat. I just breathed. The sky had darkened slightly, clouds gathering, a shadow over the celebration. The violinist resumed playing, off-key at first, then steadier. The ceremony lurched forward. The script continued. But it wasn't the same. The magic had cracked. The facade had thinned. I asked the driver to take me home. As we pulled away, I glanced in the side mirror. The venue shrank behind us, all flowers and white fabric and glass smiles. A stage built for a fairy tale, now slightly askew. The music faded into the wind. I didn't regret not being inside that tent. I didn't need applause or confrontation. What I needed had already happened. Sometimes, presence is not about where you are. It's about what you leave behind. I don't know what they had expected me to do. Write a check, wear something beige, sit quietly near the back, and smile while I watched my grandson pledge forever to someone who treated family like furniture. Functional, but best left unseen. Perhaps they thought I'd feel lucky just to be included, grateful to take a picture and then disappear again, like a seasonal ornament brought out for tradition's sake. Instead, they got silence, my absence, and a name that didn't belong in the script they had written. The aftermath was quiet at first. A pause after the reading, the kind that hangs like smoke in a room. No one knew whether to clap or cough. I imagined the guests trying to rearrange their expressions, unsure whether what had just happened was a gesture of love or betrayal. I didn't need to be there to picture it. I knew these people. I had watched them at every birthday, every holiday. They followed social cues like choreography, and when the music changed, they stumbled. Julia's name had landed like a pebble dropped into a pool, but the ripples spread fast. I knew she hadn't expected it. I could almost see her from the back of my mind, wide-eyed and still, her hands probably frozen mid-fold in her lap. She was never one to make a scene, but there would be no hiding from this one. The moment her name was spoken in that pristine white tent, everything shifted. The bride, Lauren, likely tried to mask her reaction, the way people do when they're on camera. But anger has a heat that doesn't photograph well. It leaks through posture and breath. Her mouth would have tightened, her shoulders pulling back just a little too sharply. And Liam, he would have looked around for someone to explain what just happened, as if confusion might protect him from the sting of being publicly, irrevocably excluded. My gift wasn't money, it was perspective. That evening, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It read, "You are a cruel woman. Nothing more, no name." I didn't respond. I deleted it, then brewed myself a pot of tea. There are people who believe kindness must always be quiet. That to make a choice out loud is to be petty or vindictive, but what they forget is that silence can also be cruel, and mine had gone on long enough. Later that night, I opened my laptop and scrolled through the photos already uploaded from the wedding. Hashtags, smiles, golden hour lighting. Most of the captions avoided acknowledging what had happened, but a few, buried in comment threads, referred to the moment. Some praised me, others didn't. That was fine. The letter wasn't written for applause. I found one photo of Julia standing outside the tent. She wasn't dressed like the rest, her clothes simpler, her expression unguarded. She held a small velvet pouch in her hand, and though she wasn't smiling, there was something steady in her gaze. Like she had just received something too important to be processed all at once. It wasn't money she was holding. It was proof, Names carry weight. That's something I'd come to learn late in life. I had spent decades signing mine on things: checks, permission slips, condolence cards, forms that reduce people's lives to boxes. My name had been used to co-sign debts, smooth over conflicts, keep peace at the expense of honesty. But for once, I had used it to shift a balance, to draw a line between obligation and intention. And that line had split right through the heart of what they thought was guaranteed. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my son. I stared at the screen and let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. Later that day, Julia stopped by. She didn't mention the letter. She didn't ask why I had done it. She only brought a bag of groceries and a small bunch of tulips, slightly wilted but still colorful. I thanked her and made us tea. We sat on the porch, letting the breeze pull at the edges of the conversation. There was nothing awkward between us, just space, just ease. She didn't need to say thank you, and I didn't need to ask how it felt to hear her name spoken in a room where no one had prepared for it. Sometimes being named is the most radical act of love. In the weeks that followed, I heard little from the rest of the family. The wedding faded from conversation. No one sent photos. No one called to recap. A few neighbors asked if I had gone, and I answered honestly, I had not, but I had been there in my own way. That seemed to confuse them. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean, like a slate had been wiped, not of history, but of performance. The roles we pretend to play in each other's lives: dutiful grandmother, loyal matriarch, silent witness, they had been stripped away. What remained was choice. My name had once been printed on invitations, on thank you cards, on plaques. But this time, it was not my name that needed to be seen. It was hers, the one who showed up when no one else did, the one who called me by my first name when others only used titles, the one whose absence would have gone unnoticed until it didn't. And when her name echoed through that perfect wedding tent, it rewrote the story they thought they were telling. Forever had a new beginning. And it didn't start with a vow. It started with a name on the wrong line. The applause had been hesitant, scattered at first, then awkwardly gathered like someone trying to save face after tripping on stage. But it didn't last. Nothing ruins a celebration faster than unexpected honesty. And the truth, once spoken, doesn't ask permission to stay. It just settles in the corners of the room, in the tightening of jaws, in the averted gazes, in the rearrangement of seating charts that suddenly feel meaningless. The day after the wedding, my house was still. No one called. No one dropped by. I sat in my kitchen, the window cracked open just enough to let in the early spring air. Birds chirped like they hadn't noticed the shift in the atmosphere. I held a cup of lukewarm coffee and stared at the table, not because I was waiting, but because it had become a habit to sit quietly and let the noise of others fade. Around noon, my phone lit up. It was Liam. I let it ring. He tried again 20 minutes later. Then again that evening. I didn't answer. He left a message eventually, his voice tight, like he was trying to sound calm, but couldn't quite get the heat out of it. He asked me why. He asked how I could do something so humiliating. He said it wasn't fair, that it was his day, and I had made it about something else. He didn't mention Julia. He didn't mention Lauren. He only talked about himself. I didn't call back. I had nothing left to explain. My silence was not punishment. It was a boundary, and for the first time, it was holding. The following week, a few envelopes arrived. One was from a florist, an invoice with a note scribbled on the bottom that read, "Sorry we missed you." Another was a generic thank you card signed by someone who had likely never met me. The handwriting was loopy, insincere. I threw them both away, but one envelope I kept. It was from Julia. She hadn't texted. She hadn't emailed. She had written by hand, in neat, careful print, as if each word mattered. The note was short. She said she didn't know how to thank me, and maybe she never would fully know how, but she promised me this: she would use the gift wisely, live with integrity, and never forget who stood by her when it would have been easier to stay quiet. She included a photo, not from the wedding, but from her new apartment. A corner window with light streaming in, a bookshelf, a cup of tea on the windowsill, a life beginning, softly. I placed the letter in the drawer beside my bed. Days passed, then a week, then another. The phone stayed mostly silent. A few family members tried to reach out through social media, liking old posts or sending vague messages. "Hope you're well." I didn't reply. I had no interest in patching what was never real to begin with. I went back to my routines, watering the violets, folding laundry in the quiet rhythm I had always known. I visited the farmer's market, picked up fresh eggs, honey, and peaches that bruised too easily in the bag. I baked. I sat on the porch in the late afternoons, letting the sun press against my skin like a warm reassurance. The world hadn't ended. It had simply changed its shape. One evening, just before sunset, a neighbor stopped me at the mailbox. She had seen the photos online. She said, in that careful tone people use when they're afraid of stepping on something delicate, that what I'd done had been a statement. I smiled politely. But when she added that some people were still talking about it, I looked her in the eye and said, "Let them." I didn't owe comfort to those who had only ever shown up for ceremony. The hardest part wasn't being ignored. It was realizing how many years I had spent performing my role without question. The good grandmother, the silent supporter, the one who gave but didn't ask, who listened but wasn't heard. But when I stopped playing the part, everything else became clear. The invitations that never came, the calls only made when something was needed, the way my presence had been treated like background noise, tolerated, not treasured. Now, the silence felt different, not absence, freedom. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't walk around with bitterness folded under my ribs. I simply no longer carried weight that didn't belong to me. I had set it down without announcement or apology. Let the applause fade. Let the pictures be posted, edited, filtered, remembered however they needed to be. I would not be part of their story, not the way they wanted, but in the places that mattered, in the quiet corners of honesty and choice. My presence remained, not as a shadow, as a line drawn, firm, unshaken, and if that meant silence afterward, so be it. Some things are truer in the quiet. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of small, steady things. Morning light through lace curtains, the whistle of the kettle as it began to steam, the soft thump of the mail slipping through the slot. Days didn't feel heavy anymore. They moved at their own pace, slower than before, but honest in their rhythm. There was no one demanding, no one expecting, no one waiting for a response that came with guilt. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just living finally as myself. I started tending to the garden again. The violets had held on despite the neglect, their roots stronger than I'd expected. I pulled weeds with my hands, felt the dirt under my nails, and didn't mind. I spent whole afternoons pruning and digging and planting new things. Herbs mostly, rosemary, thyme, lavender. They grew quietly, without needing attention, just enough water and patience. I found comfort in that. Sundays used to be loud, full of family, laughter, obligations. Now they were mine. I cooked small meals for myself. I didn't set extra places at the table. I didn't wait for anyone to knock on the door. I found an old recipe for blackberry jam, made 3 jars, and left one on the porch for Julia. She picked it up the next day, left a note tucked into the door frame. "This tastes like home." That made me smile. Julia called sometimes, not often, never out of obligation, just to tell me about her new job at the library or the neighbor who lent her a ladder that nearly collapsed. Her voice was lighter, freer. She sounded like someone who had finally exhaled after holding her breath for too long. I didn't press her for visits, but when she came, she always brought something: scones she tried baking, a secondhand novel she thought I'd like, a photo of her new apartment with sunlight pouring across the wooden floor. She had framed the letter I wrote. She didn't hang it. She kept it in her bookshelf between cookbooks and poetry. She told me once that she read it when she needed to remember who she was. There were others who tried to return: distant cousins who messaged me on holidays, old friends of Liam who left comments under my posts. I didn't answer them all. I didn't need to. There was no bitterness left, just clarity. I didn't hold a grudge. I had simply released. Sometimes I sat on the porch at dusk and thought about the past, not with sadness, but with a strange kind of peace. I had done what I could. I had loved people who didn't love back in the way I needed. I had poured into vessels that didn't hold water. And then, one day, I had stopped. That didn't make me cruel. It made me free. I reconnected with old acquaintances, women from the church group I used to lead, neighbors I had exchanged polite waves with but never spoken to deeply. We began sharing meals, stories, laughter. We met on Friday mornings at the corner cafe, the one with chipped mugs and the best coffee in town. We talked about aches and books and childhoods. We made each other laugh in the way only older women can: sharp, warm, unfiltered. They became my people. Family, I learned, is not just blood. It's not the people who share your name. It's the ones who show up, who see you, who listen when your voice is quiet and still hear everything. It's those who treat your presence not as a favor, but as a privilege. The ones who carry your memory with care. One afternoon, Julia came over with a paper bag and nervous eyes. She handed it to me without speaking. Inside was a folded baby onesie, yellow with tiny bees on the sleeves. She said she was nervous, not planned, but not afraid. She was going to do it on her own, but not alone. Because she had people now. Because she had me. I took her hands in mine and nodded. We didn't say much after that. We just sat together, hands clasped, watching the wind move through the branches of the oak tree in the yard. Later, I pulled out the family ring box again, not the one with the ruby I had given her at the wedding, but another one, smaller. Inside was a gold locket that had belonged to my grandmother. I had kept it through wars and losses and moves and birthdays. I had always thought I'd give it to someone who would understand that family is something you build, not something you inherit. That love isn't owed, it's earned and nurtured. I placed it in Julia's hand. For the first time in years, I felt a stillness in my chest that wasn't resignation. It was fullness, the sense that I hadn't lost anything, not really. I had made room. I had opened a door and someone had walked through, not out of convenience, but out of truth. I watched the light stretch across the floor that evening and thought about all the names people give each other: grandma, mother, friend, burden, blessing. In the end, none of them matter as much as the actions behind them. She calls me family, and I believe her.